think it's about time the gay brothers and sisters got their rights, and especially the women.
The Stonewall riot was a major historical event that paved the way for political movements and activism in the LGBTQ community. This uprising existed alongside other countercultures in the 60s, like the civil rights movement, sexual revolution, etc., which were all created to subvert established beliefs. And Stonewall is no different. The violent protests carried out were a demonstration of years of societal oppression demanding to be broken free. It started when police raids took place in the early hours of June 28, 1969. They would check the bargoes' identifications, then arrest those who cross-dressed, including mafia members and employees. That night, the community had enough of this unfair treatment. Thus, they responded by throwing beer cans, bricks, and bottles. Amongst the crowd fighting back were homeless youths, the LGBTQ bargoers, and people who were attracted by the commotion. The rioting scene was a culmination of an enraged collective conscience that had grown tired with the law. It lasted for several nights, and while many suspected it was organized, it was not. Before Stonewall, police raids happened as often as once a month. They regularly went undercover to entrap homosexuals. Being gay was a huge taboo. The DSM, which is the Manual of Mental Disorders, even supported the homosexuals are mentally ill claim by listing it as a mental disorder, and it stayed until it was removed in 1974. The documentary film Lavender Scare depicts homosexuals getting fired from federal employment because they were deemed security risks. The public thought homosexuals were susceptible to bribery, and so they were often linked with communists, aka the Red Scare, because in the public's eyes, they both exhibit un-American behaviors. In addition, gay soldiers were not particularly welcome in the military. In fact, they saw it as a crime. Later movies like Serving in Silence and Sergeant Matlovich vs. the US Air Force also depicted the struggles of these people living under such a law. Serving in Silence shows Glenn Close's character taking her case to court when she is dismissed from the military for revealing her homosexuality. The film Sergeant Matlovich also have the same plot, but with an openly gay veteran. These films stress the absurdity of these laws and how its continuous trend of denying LGBT people from serving in the military have led them to oppose this discrimination policy. After Stonewall, more LGBT activist organizations were formed, and they only grew in numbers through the years. The two most famous ones are Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance. They differ from the previous organizations in that they did not think twice about using the word gay, since that word was pretty stigmatized back then. Not even the Village Voice reached the extent of liberalness in their newspapers. In fact, this newspaper along with the New York Daily News were called out for using gay slurs when describing the riot, which makes it ironic because the Village Voice was considered to be the most liberal published material in the Greenwich neighborhood. Although police raids still continue, people were becoming aware of this issue. There were annual gay pride marches to commemorate the uprising in and outside of America. In addition, the decriminalization of homosexuality started to unfold internationally. Stonewall marked the birth of the gay liberation movement. People would participate in radical actions, coming out, and zapping, which is a way of getting a public figure to acknowledge gay rights, to oppose homophobia. Notable examples are the zapping raids carried out by GAA members at ABC's New York headquarters when they aired negative portrayals of the community on television. Famous people who have been targets by the GAA were Mayor John Lindsay and William Friedkin. Above all, in the context of media representations, social acceptance of the LGBTQ community was gradual in spite of how many media attention they get, as movies like putting LGBTQ roles into stereotypical categories and pushing a homonormative view, which is essentially the same heteronormative lifestyle but with homosexuals. According to Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, the visibility and conceptualization of homosexuals is largely conveyed through the visual medium. In this case, heterosexuals' ideas towards them are shaped off of their representations in media. For instance, effeminate men and masculine women are a definition of LGBT for them, whilst knowledge of non-binaries and queer members may come off as superficial as there are not enough of their presence on television. Misrepresentations and negative stereotypes will greatly contribute to these ideas of gender shaping. Entering the 70s, LGBT characters start gaining traction in primetime television, even though they are reduced to supporting roles. It was a huge step forward nonetheless compared to the biased Hollywood portrayals of them from before. The 1972 film That Certain Summer was the first to defeat the nuclear family normal by having a gay man raising a family and coming out to his son. This TV movie was also the first sympathetic approach to tackling a gay story. It didn't have the usual melodramatic, living under oppression traits that some LGBT movies have. It's quite special in the sense that the parent is the one coming out to the child, and not the other way around. Despite the LGBT community having a surge in media presence, some of them were just made for laughs. With a typically flamboyant gay attitude and such, these archetypal characteristics are later woven into an established stock character. Besides that, transgender people were still heavily underrepresented in films, due to the fact that they used to be portrayed as unstable psychopaths. This is depicted in Psycho. The transphobia is subtly highlighted in the cross-dressing murderer Norman, a device used to hint at the supposed mental illness transgender people carry. This also reinforces Butler's theory of performativity being constructed through behavior in a visual medium. Two more instances of transgender portrayals are Women in Revolt and In a Year of 13 Moons, where the former is a spoof and the latter is a more emphatic way of presenting social challenges they have to face. That aside, the 70s also witnessed a social shift concerning the employment and recognition of LGBT people. For example, Frank Kameny, an influential gay rights activist who got fired from his astronomer job because of his sexuality, became a candidate for Congress. Harvey Milk became the first elected gay politician to sit for Californian office, while Angela Morley became the first transgender person to be nominated for an Oscar. The 80s didn't come without its challenges. The AIDS epidemic surfaced, and the community once again finds itself dealing with prejudice amidst negative reception spread around them after making progress in the last decade. Media coverage of the topic opted to substitute the word AIDS in their publications. The New York Times in particular was laggard at addressing this issue. It took them 2 years to publish AIDS-related articles, and when they did, it never was covered in the national news section. Instead, they placed it at the styles section at the back of the newspaper. Even so, they went for clinical terms like homosexuals instead of gay, bodily fluids instead of semen, and that style of puritanical writing was seen as discriminatory insults to a lot of LGBTQ Americans. In addition, the ongoing themes featured in AIDS-related movies and mass media are all one-sided depictions. They create a division by stirring in the otherness, such as depicting gay men as guilty of infecting healthy people, and heterosexism, which only focuses on gay males living with AIDS, while disregarding the likelihood of the rest of the human population contracting it. Instances of AIDS movies are In Early Frost, Parting Glances, and Long Time Companion, and they all share the same gay male character battling AIDS tropes. Nevertheless, this decade educated people about the LGBT community more than ever, and the epidemic made them learn to take the community seriously. Well-known public figures in AIDS activism are Pedro Zamora, an openly gay AIDS educator who raised awareness by appearing on MTV, and Madonna, who advocated for research because she lost a lot of her friends to the disease.
If you do have sex, use a condom. It may be the most important thing you ever do.
Then there was the 90s, where World Health Organization officially declared homosexuality to not be an illness. Moreover, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was enacted to allow closeted homosexuals and bisexuals to serve in the military. Homosexual acts were not outlawed in the military again. However, a number of gay people were expected to conceal their sexual orientation because of this. If they are openly gay, they are unfit to serve. This led to its repeal in 2011 when Obama was in office.
We are not a nation that says, don't ask, don't tell. We are a nation that says, out of many, we are one.
Who also turned out to be the first president to openly acknowledge the community in his speech by using terms such as gays and lesbians.
We put a stop to discrimination against gays and lesbians, whether in the office or on the battlefield.
During this decade, media representations of LGBT culture had a resurgence after the AIDS-dominated decade. It presented gay people the opportunity to play openly gay characters for the first time. In My So-Called Life, the gay actor Wilson Cruz of Afro-Puerto Rican descent was cast. This made him the first person of color to play an intersectional role. Next was Ellen DeGeneres, who came out in her own sitcom.
I'm gay.
It was a tough time for Ellen back then, regardless of the outpouring of support she received from the community. She has been threatened with bomb and death threats and was forced to cancel the show a year later. Other than that, popular 90s sitcoms which included LGBT characters were Friends, such as Ross's ex-wife being a lesbian. Will and Grace is also another groundbreaking sitcom featuring its main character, Will, as a gay lawyer. Even The Simpsons strongly hinted that Mr. Smithers was homosexual. Having famous shows and celebrities to represent a community on screen set a precedent for more recognizable people to come out, and also normalized his culture in popular media. While LGBT representations are a positive thing, there was a lack of intersectionality. The white experience was the dominant portrayal of the community. Colored members of the queer community were never the central focus. It was only until the late 90s that black LGBT people started making appearances on films. Examples are Looking for Langston, which is an impressionistic film about black gay identity, and Rude, which featured a closeted homosexual colored man living in a poor neighborhood. From the 2000s onwards, LGBT culture becomes increasingly ubiquitous on the internet. We see films covering black people from different walks of LGBT experiences. For example, there's the film Tangerine about transgender people, the film Bassie about bisexuals, the film The Skinny about queer members, and lastly, Moonlight, which is about a black youth exploring his sexuality. Even so, representations of the black queer community were still quite inaccurate. The 2000s paved way for change because of more integration in the 90s. People like Madonna made ballroom culture mainstream after her iconic video Vogue. Ballroom culture was originally created for the queer community to come together. The Vogue scene is depicted in both Paris is Burning and Pose, where queer people of color deal with racism and poverty in the ball culture landscape. Moreover, the media has a tendency to fetishize people of color or make them race neutral, meaning they overlook the person's race. An example of fetishizing is the over-sexualization of LGBT Latinas. These can be seen in Glee and Grey's Anatomy when both Santana Lopez and Kelly Torres are depicted as promiscuous at some point. This again conforms to Butler's gender theory, as we form our ideas based on the stereotypes we see in the visual medium. Furthermore, pop culture became the primary channel for gay culture to flourish. This is evidenced in pop culture phenomena such as RuPaul's Drag Race, the music of Todrick Hall, and the first trans Miss Universe. However, these representations are stereotypically flamboyant of how all gay men should be. But the community is still flourishing and empowering a lot of queer individuals to embrace their inner queens. It's social empowerment and self-discovery in one package. Yet despite its entrance into mainstream, the Drag Race shows are limited to gay or cisgender male performers who cross-dress. RuPaul was against having trans participants. His comments on transgender contestants about them taking it too seriously did spark debates and backlash online. Speaking of transgender roles on screen, most of them are played by cis actors like Jeffrey Tambor, Jared Leto, and Elle Fanning. Wanting diversity but refusing to cast actual trans actors further discriminates the community. The world of video games also made improvements concerning LGBT individuals. Some of these games manage to pair homosexuality with masculinity or femininity together without making the usual mistake of overtly stereotyping. In addition, comics also began advancing LGBT themes by the 90s and onwards. Mainstream comics adopted an inclusive stance by making Batwoman and Green Lantern gay icons. In short, the LGBT community has made significant progress since Stonewall in terms of media employments and media representations. That being said, it doesn't mean that it still does not face discrimination. Like racism, homophobia, or transphobia cannot be terminated entirely. It takes efforts and research from the media to transmit a non-biased story to a heteronormative public to actually change their perception towards the community. There are still tons of countries where homosexuality is illegal, and an approximate dozen of them made it punishable by death. And for this reason, they have a long way to go, as change can only be seen in a portion of the world, not everywhere. Anyway, to conclude, in light of Stonewall, the major changes that were made after the years are the legalization of same-sex marriage in all the states in America, the founding of GLAAD, and many celebratory days, among many other great things. It has normalized into broader culture and will continue in days to come.